proceeded to write about many interesting things and in ways that even I can understand. So I'm really excited to have him here this afternoon. He'll be talking about security, and just because Simson is paranoid doesn't mean that we're not going to be recording this session. So please help me welcome him.
Hi, I really want to thank you guys for having me here. I love this company. I love being here. It's a great place. The last time I spoke at Microsoft Research was in 2000, and I gave this long talk about basically fair information practices. And at the end of the talk, this guy in the back raised his hand and said, all you've been doing for the last hour is talking about fair information practices, and that's kind of old stuff. And I kind of was embarrassed by this. So today I'm going to start off with a review of the literature. And I will not be accused of slighting anything else. And after I give a brief review of the literature, I'm going to discuss 3 research projects that I've been involved with. The first one that I did with a man named Peter Shipley, that I'm going to be talking about a project that he's largely done on his own, and that I was somewhat involved with, but not much. And then I'm going to be talking about a project that I've started that I'm doing on my own, and I'm always looking for advice and suggestions. Let's see if we can make this technology work. I pressed the button, and there it goes. We're talking about not-so-covert channels, finding data in plain sight. This is the 5th different title for this talk. So if it's not the talk you were expecting, don't leave now. It'll still be good. Let's say runtime error has occurred. Right, that's my joke. In classic computer security, you have these requirements like confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then we have a whole bunch of techniques that we use to implement those requirements, like encryption and mandatory access controls and authentication. And so when I showed up at MIT, nobody ever spelled this out for me. But I quickly learned about this sort of stuff. And I also learned that there's these things called covert channels, which are basically ways for getting around all the technology that we put in place to implement our requirements. And covert channels just bypass all the technology that we put in place. You might have a covert channel that allows you to bypass the encryption technology, and it lets you get out the data before it's encrypted or after it's decrypted. Or you might have one that lets that makes the authentication not matter. It lets you to grab the data after the authorized user authenticates through your covert channel. Or you might have covert channels that allow you to bypass mandatory access controls. And the way I found out about covert channels is I was at MIT and we had this big computer there called a Multics. Does anybody remember Multicses? This is this big military MIT Honeywell project. And this computer, that's one computer, for anybody who doesn't remember, computers that big. It would fit in a room about this size, and it's less powerful than your Palm Pilot or than your Pocket PC. But it had a formal design which implemented a very strong computer security architecture. It had this thing called a reference monitor. It had a ring-based architecture. Data was tagged and labeled. And it was designed so you could have something called multi-level security. So you could have a top-secret process and just a regular old classified process and then an unclassified process running on the same computer. The theory being computers were expensive, too expensive to have a separate computer for all those different people. And then the computer would implement a security model that would prevent the top secret data from leaking into the unclassified area on the same computer. It's still a very useful concept today because we have computers that have things on it that only the computer should have, or maybe then personal information, and you don't want your personal information leaking to something else. So the concepts are still valid today. Turns out that even in Multics, there were all of these covert channels which basically allowed classified data to leak out into unclassified areas. One were timing channels. You might, and resource signaling. You might have a top secret process that would burn a lot of CPU and then would do nothing. And then would burn a lot of CPU. And you could have another process on the system that would just see how long it did to execute instructions. And then over time, you could signal bits from the classified process to the unclassified process. And of course, then there were printouts. Somebody might print something out from a hot top secret area and just carry the printout out. And then there were RF emissions. When the computer was running, it would transmit in the radio frequency spectrum. And if you tried, you could pick those up and see what it was doing. Now, this I thought was super cool. This is an H19 terminal, Heathkit 19. Anybody ever use one of these? Oh, well, one person. It turns out if you put a television set next to the H19, the television set would display what was on the H19 screen. Now, that's real. It's a television transmitter, and you could pick it up with better equipment quite some distance away. If you know, regular televisions, that is not your most high-tech spook surveillance equipment. And it turns out that you send out data through the power lines, through the video cables, through the RS-232 cables. Government knew about this. They came up with this technology and this specification called Tempest. And this was a way for blocking RF emissions from a computer. And the real problem with Tempest is, if you've ever used the Tempest machine, this is a picture I found off the web of a Tempest IBM laptop. And basically, it's a regular laptop, which you then put inside the Tempest box. And the problem is it made them really heavy and really expensive. Not something you want to use. I was trying to get a Tempest Sun workstation, but I couldn't find any photos of that. Ross Anderson over in England came up with this technique he called soft Tempest, which makes the majority of the Tempest problems go away. It turns out the biggest leak, is the screen and the flyback transformer and basically modulations of the electron beam. And what Ross Anderson found was that simply by changing the fonts, going from these on-off fonts to these blurry fonts, you could attenuate the majority of the RF emissions coming off. And when you looked at it on a screen, it didn't look that different. It sort of looks like a Mac running OS X. It's all blurry. And so here's the URL. If you want, Ross Anderson says that this is his single most referenced paper, and it's what gets the most downloads. And it's super cool. And he has fonts, soft Tempest fonts you can download and run on Windows. Excellent. So what does Tempest teach us? Tempest teaches us that the good news is that we can identify covert channels, and we can analyze them, and we can eliminate them. Maybe all of them. The bad news is that's really hard to do. And even when you solve these problems, people are reluctant to use your solutions. Like, I don't use Ross Anderson's fonts. You guys probably don't use Ross Anderson's fonts. We don't really care about Tempest. You know, like, what do we care if somebody's eavesdropping on our screens and reading everything we do? There's a Tempest story that I have that's not on the slides. I have a friend who used to work at the NSA. And I was talking to her one day, and she said, I got to go. I said, why? And she says, there's some guys out in the parking lot, and they're aiming this antenna at me. I got to go. And so she calls me back later. Turned out that there were these guys with a big dish antenna outside the parking lot, right outside the fence, pointed at the building. Now, a few years ago, the NSA rebuilt all of its buildings. They found it was too expensive to buy Tempest computers, so they made their buildings Tempest buildings. They covered them with copper. And these guys were out there, and she called security. She was a security officer. Security went out. She went out, and they said, it's okay, we're security too. We're trying to see if there are any emissions. So it was sort of a red team situation. Now, Anderson has found, Ross Anderson's one of my heroes. He has found all these other covert channels. He's made a lot of news lately with attacks against smart cards. Here's a smart card. And smart cards are great. We can use them to hold key material. You can get smart cards that have fingerprint readers on them. So your secret key never leaves the smart card. Simply data comes onto the smart card. It gets signed or encrypted or decrypted. It leaves the smart card. Anderson has found power covert channels. Some smart cards will actually modulate the power line with information that you can use to figure out what their secret key is. Or timing channels. You can give them different things to encrypt. And depending on what the key is, they take a different amount of time to encrypt it. And then lately, he came out with these photonic channels. You can open up the smart card and look at the bits. You actually can do this. It's super cool. And there are these other covert channels that have come out recently, modem lights. Anybody familiar with this? This is so cool. If you can see somebody's modem, the little lights flashing on the modem, you can use a telescope and you can pick up the bits. As long as it's not like faster than 56K. And if you can capture the signal fast enough, you can get the bits. It doesn't work on a T1 modem, but it will work on a telephone modem. And there's the paper. The SIRCAM virus. Have you guys had a problem with the SIRCAM virus here? It was like running around everywhere. And what it does is it emails you a document from somebody's hard drive, and it attaches itself to the document. Very clever. So I started getting all these weird documents, and I couldn't figure out why I was getting them. I got somebody's PowerPoint presentation, I got somebody's spreadsheet, I got a word processor file. It turns out a lot of confidential documents were sent out by SIRCAM. In some cases, classified documents were sent out by SIRCAM through firewalls and with more copies of the virus. There's this thing about Microsoft Exchange public folders, which you can look at. Turns out that it's another covert channel. Exchange servers will frequently make things available on the Internet to people who are not registered Exchange users. It's terrible. And of course, web browsers, a lot of the whole story about web privacy issues was the discovery of covert channels in web browsers. First one being the refer field. Whenever you hit a website, it very helpfully provided the URL of the previous website that you had been at. It's in the web protocol. It was really bad if the previous one had confidential information. On my website, since most, when I look at my log files, I can see what people did searches on before they showed up on my website, because Google and Lycos and AltaVista all do searches as get URLs instead of as post URLs. And so I get the whole search string in the refer field. So that's kind of cool. Oh, by the way, if anybody has a question or comment at any point, please interrupt me. I'm going to talk about 3 covert channels in today's talks. I'm first going to talk about unprotected modems, which most people don't think of as covert channels, but I wanted to talk about the research, and it seemed like a covert channel. I'm going to talk about 802.11 networks. You've probably heard about war driving. If everybody here has heard about war driving, I'll go through that real quick, but it's kind of interesting. And then I'm going to talk about this new research project that I'm starting, which is all about discarded media. So let's start. I have a company. It's called Sandstorm Enterprises, and the first product we did was a war dialer. And there's a paper that has been passed out, which is based on this next segment. So war dialing was popularized in this 1983 movie, War Games. And the idea is you dial phone numbers with your modem, and you look for other modems that answer. And then you try to break into those systems. It's a very low-cost attack. You make lots of local phone calls. You're a high school kid. You're dialing from your residential phone line, so it's free. Or even better, you dial 800 numbers, and that's free. We used to think there was a really high probability of getting caught. We thought that the phone company was looking for this. I actually printed it in a book that I wrote, that the phone company was looking for people dialing sequential phone numbers. They're not. Believe me, they're not. I've never heard from them. When we were testing at Sandstorm, when we were testing PhoneSweep, our war dialer, we got 12 residential phone lines that all had service to Call Martha's Vineyard, where the modem bank was that we were calling. And one of the lines had call detail turned on. And one month, I got a phone bill that was 2 inches thick that had 34,000 phone calls. Flat rate residential dialing, $64. And they just the computer put $2.50 of postage on the phone bill, sent it out to me. They're not paying attention. The really cool thing about war dialing is that the modems that you hit are frequently behind firewalls, so it's a great way to get access to corporate LANs. Here's the technique, the secret war dialing algorithm. You determine the next phone number to call. You call it. You identify what answers. It might be a carrier, fax, voice. If it's busy, you have to repeat. And then you repeat, and you analyze the results. That's how you do it. And Pete Shipley is this guy I collaborate with. Between April 1997 and January 2000, Pete Shipley dialed every single phone number in the San Francisco Bay Area. 5.7 million phone numbers. This is so insane. So these are the area codes. And it turns out that like every now and then he had a bug in his software. He was not using phone sweep. He was using a program called Tone Lock. And some days he got $300 phone bills when it sort of wandered out into a toll area by accident. Then, I knew that he had done this, and I said, Pete, can I have all your data? I want to analyze it. And he said, sure. And so I did the analysis with him. We found 46,000 modems that answered. And before I did the analysis with him, I actually wrote an article that appeared in the San Jose Mercury News when I was pretending to be a journalist. So some days I pretend to be a journalist, and some days I pretend to be a computer scientist. And just, I usually let you know what I'm doing. The first thing we found, and he found this one, is that business and residential exchanges really look different. That's a business exchange. That yellow line is a modem bank. This is a residential exchange. The yellow dots are modems. Why are there modems answering in a residential phone number? In residential exchange, they're there. And the color code really doesn't matter. But the key thing is that you see these very different fingerprints of an exchange, if it's a residential exchange or business exchange. And the other key thing that matters is that you can identify things very quickly. The second finding was that modems are very friendly. A lot of them. They're about 94 per exchange. And in the UC exchange, University of California, Berkeley, their modem exchanges, they actually had 4% to 6% modems. 87% of the modems responded with a banner. Pete collected 335,000 lines of banners. Yes?
I don't know what the significance of the banner is.
Well, the banner is something that says, hi, you've reached this modem. And it might be very friendly and tell you who owns the modem. Gives you their name and address and phone number and how to contact them, which is great if you're trying to find a machine for breaking in that belongs to a particular bank. Microsoft RAS was really good. It does not give a banner. And Phone Sweep actually will then send a probe string that Microsoft RAS will then answer to. Less than 2% of the modems that we hit had warning banners. Now, I've given my pocket pager just went off, and I gave somebody, but it's not him. I said if he had any questions, he should page me. He's watching. And less than 2% of the things actually had warning banners. There's actually case law that says if you don't get a warning banner and somebody tries to break in, they may not be prosecutable. So the third finding that we found was that a lot of the modems were vulnerable. 3% of all the Shiva Land Rovers, for instance, had no password on the root account. And root was this backdoor that the folks at Shiva had put into the modems. They put two administrator logins, one called admin, which they documented, and one called root that they forgot to document. 30% of the Ascend systems out there simply gave an Ascend prompt, which meant that you could then telnet or rlog into other machines. And the majority of the Cisco routers gave a command prompt, which meant they had no username or password authentication. 25% of them were in the enable mode, which meant you could zero the router config. Now, the Cisco things are a little misleading because it may be that they have usernames and passwords. It may be that a modem was put on the system console, and the system console wasn't set up to do the modem control lines, so that when the person hung up, the modem didn't automatically log them out. And then the next person who calls in gets the old login session. And that actually can happen a lot. A lot of people put modems on just terminal ports rather than on modem ports, and they don't have the extra stuff hooked up. This was one of the trophies that Pete found. This is the Oakland Fire Dispatch System. This is one of the help screens. You could send the trucks wherever you wanted. So the interesting thing about Pete was he found these things, but he, for the most part, he didn't call up the companies or the cities that he found to tell them about the problems that he had found, because he was making a living as a computer security consultant. And then when they asked him to do computer security consulting, he would just consult the big database and say, oh, I found your modems, by the way. I called up Oakland to confirm this. This was so important that he had actually told the FBI to tell them, and they had dealt with the problem. He found a lease line control system. That's really important. In March 1997, the Worcester County Airport in Massachusetts was shut down because a kid found the dial-up for a lease line control system, and he basically told it to shut down because he didn't know what it was doing. He was trying to figure it out. And it turned off radar and telephones and radio to the control tower at the airport. Whoops. Cody's bookstore had, anybody ever heard of a shop at Cody's bookstore? So you could call into the modem and you could look up customer names and credit card numbers and see what customers had ordered. Pete hadn't called Cody's bookstore. I called them, and they were very thankful. They said that they had done a software upgrade and they had forgotten to fix this, and I couldn't understand how a software upgrade could cause a modem to be opened. Berkeley Pediatrics, you called up that one and you got a concurrent DOS prompt, which meant you had access by running the programs to all patient records that were computerized. Probably not the charts, given the level of sophistication at the business, but probably patient names and maybe which specialists they were seeing. I called up Berkeley Pediatrics repeatedly to get a comment from them, and they would never return my phone calls. Numerous Land Rovers at financial institutions behind firewalls. I called not like a currency trading company. They don't trade stocks and bonds. They trade money. And they were very thankful that I called, and they said they had dealt with the problem. And we found a dial-up for a high-voltage transmission line system, which, again, required no username or password. And now I didn't actually discover that for 2 years later. As we were tuning the expert system that PhoneSweep uses to recognize modems from banners, I got this one that I didn't know what it was. So I started doing web searches on the weird words in the banner, and I found out that, yes, in fact, it was the control system for a high-voltage power line transmission system. And hopefully the bad guys don't find it. So conclusions of the whole war dialing project, dial-up modems continue to represent a vulnerability for many organizations. Now, this is kind of an odd conclusion, because this is the age of the Internet, right? But it turns out that a lot of these modem systems, companies don't even know they have them hooked up. There are modem systems out there for HVAC systems and elevators, and they're like there for service. And what we're actually seeing is that more systems are answering modems rather than less. More and more systems are having dial-up capability for service and maintenance. This is a problem because many of these phone lines are not within the block of phone numbers that a corporation will have. Like a corporation might have, 258 XXXX, and they own that block. But then they'll have 5 or 10 dial-up modems that just have POTS lines ordered from the phone company. Which really means that if you want to identify the vulnerabilities in a geographical area, you have to do what Pete Shipley did, which is you have to call every single phone number in that geographical area. And that is time-consuming. I'm sorry?
How long did that take?
Well, it took Pete 3 years, but he only had 2 to 4 modems going at a time. If you're going to use something like PhoneSweep, a multi-line war dialer, we can do 24 modems at a time. We can dial 10,000 numbers in an hour, but a city, that's like 10 million phone numbers. So it's still going to take a long time. And it's something you need to keep doing. And whose job is that to do, right? If you run a bank, it's not your job to dial every phone number in Seattle because somebody in one of your branches might have bought a POTS line to hook up their elevator to. So it's not clear whose job that is. Maybe it's the Homeland Defense's job. So I'm going to go on to war driving. So everybody here, question back.
Is a fax modem a vulnerability?
Oh, fax modems. I haven't put anything up about fax modems because I'm still doing research on that. But let me talk to you about fax modems. Many fax, well, there are 2 kinds of fax modems. There are fax modems that are in your computer, and there are fax modems that are in fax machines. Now, the fax modem in your computer is only as vulnerable as the software on your computer that answers the modem. So I don't know if there are buffer overflow attacks in like Carbon, the fax software that you can buy. But there might be, because I don't have the source code. The modems in fax machines are a vulnerability. Many modern fax machines have memory. And many of those systems have pins that you can submit to them, and then they will share with you the contents of their memory. Some fax machines have 50 pages of memory, and they will very happily give you the last 50 pages that they sent or received. So a future version of PhoneSweep might have a fax capability and might do brute force attacks on fax machines. But we haven't coded that up yet. it certainly does seem like it would be an interesting thing to do. And many organizations that have fax machines that have memory aren't aware that their machines have memory, and many of them may have default pins. Yes?
Who's your favorite modem hardware vendor for war dialing?
My favorite modem vendor for war dialing is Rockwell or Connexent. And the reason, but only their real modem chips, not their soft modem chips. And the reason is because I figured out how to use their voice dialing instructions, and I can answer when the modem picks up. I can tell if it's a fax or a data or a voice, and then I can switch into the appropriate mode. It's supposed to be possible to do that with the Lucent chipset, but I've never been able to figure out how to do it. Pete Shipley didn't have my software, and he used USR modems, V.anything modems, and he used Zyxel modems. And I found that once you have the special code that runs on the Rockwell modems, you get better performance with them. And I also found that you should do war dialing at 9600 baud, because more things answer at 9600 baud than at the higher baud rates. There are actually some systems where they have a 9600 baud console port, but then they put a high-speed modem on it. If you dial it with a high-speed modem, it will go in high-speed mode, and you can't talk to it. But if you call it 9600 baud, it usually works. People have asked us to do spread spectrum on modem on baud rates, so that we'd repeatedly call it up at different baud rates, and repeatedly call it up with different stop bits and different even odd parity, because apparently there are some systems out there that will only talk to you in 7-bit even parity. We can't do that right now. Any other questions on war dialing before I move on? Okay, so in 2000, when I took a job at a company called Broadband to Wireless, we were building a nationwide 802.11 wireless network, but we didn't have enough money, and they didn't do what I told them to do, and they went out of business. While I was doing that, Pete Shipley started on this big war driving project, which has now become a popular geek pastime. And so what he did was he got an 802.11 card and an 8 dB antenna, GPS, started driving around, seeing what access points he could find. And this is a map of it's like Silicon Valley, and those little dots, Waveland Network, MV Office, 890.015, C Group. He found that a lot of businesses were basically leaking out their wireless LANs. Now, it turns out that if you look at the technology for security that's built into 802.11, it's pretty bad. It's transmitting at 2.4 gigahertz, 11 megabits per second, and it's a hub and spoke architecture. You have access points, and they provide wireless connectivity, and anybody who wants to talk on the wireless LAN talks through the access point. The basic security was this thing called SSID. If you use equipment from BreezeCom, they call it ESSID. It's basically a password that's transmitted in the clear. And when I first found out about this stuff in 2000, I said to the vendors that this did not provide security. And they said it did provide security because none of the drivers would allow you to listen in on what the SSIDs that were being transmitted were. Of course, now all the drivers do. You can just set your SSID to any or blank, and it will associate to any access point it finds. And if you're using Windows XP or Mac OS X, it will even list them for you and allow you to click which one you want to associate to. So then they told me there was this thing called WEP, Wired Equivalent Privacy. And if you look at it, just knowing practically nothing about encryption, you can simply look at the algorithm and say, this is a lousy encryption algorithm. It's like a big polynomial-based encryption algorithm. And it even has port key setup. So when they moved from 40-bit encryption to 128-bit encryption, it didn't help. And there's actually code out there on the net you can download to crack people's WEP keys. But you know all that. So these are Pete Shipley's latest Berkeley findings. He's been driving around Berkeley. He's found 173 access points. And that's a map of Berkeley, California. And the red ones are ones that are open with no WEP and a default SSID, which means you can really just go to town with them. The orange ones have a different SSID, so you actually have to consciously associate to them. And the green ones are ones that are actually closed out with WEP. Now, remember, the fact that they're using WEP doesn't mean they're secure. It just means that you have to consciously try to break into the system rather than sort of just using it. There's a program out there called NetStumbler. Has anybody here used NetStumbler? Well, you should all download it. It runs on the iPad, it runs on XP, and it's just a lovely program for surveying wireless LANs. You could use it even here at Microsoft to see where you have better wireless coverage. It draws you a little graph of how much wireless activity there is, and it will give you a list over time of all the access points that it finds. And you can go to the NetStumbler website and upload all the open access points that you find. You can build an account on the system. And all these crosses are access points that have been reported. Now, there's some people believe that the real privacy security with 802.11 comes from walls. That walls will block the signal. As long as you use it indoors, you're secure. And this turns out to be not really true. Using an antenna like this, which is a nice 24 dB dish and a 500 milliwatt antenna, you can pretty much pick out any access point you want that you can see and associate to it. And that's the view from the hilltop in Berkeley. You can see that there are a lot of access points that you might be able to pick out. And this is somewhere where I've actually done some research. There are lots of people that are using 802.11 for long-distance links, 20 miles, 30 miles, from one mountain to another mountain. A lot of projects in, say, India, where it's a great way to get access to a rural community. There's some communities in the outer islands of Virginia that are using this. It's really great technology. It's pretty much line of sight. And if you use one of these culminating 36 dB antennas, you can get quite far. Well, if you use one of those antennas with a big amplifier, you can eavesdrop on a lot of data. Now, yes?
Antennas on Pringles cans, too.
I'm sorry? Yes, you can build a 12 dB antenna or so with a Pringles can. The wavelength is like this, so it's sort of like stuff you can do with sheet metal. The real threats with these home networks is people using your connection for nefarious purposes, like spamming, hacking, and if your 802.11 network at home is hijacked, mine is open, by the way, you can lose your service. Corporate networks, the primary threat is, of course, theft of corporate information. And then there's this whole accidental trespass thing. You might think that you're actually using the cyber cafe that you're sitting at, but you're actually using the company's network across the street. A friend of mine, he actually worked for me at Broadband to Wireless. He got a wireless LAN card, and he was going to get an access point and a DSL connection. He took it home, and he noticed that he had a signal. That was cool. So he never bought the DSL connection or the wireless base station. And he simply used the company across the street. He used their wireless LAN for the year that he lived in that apartment. And he didn't really think it was a big deal because, after all, he wasn't looking at their Microsoft Exchange server or their folders, which were all open without any passwords. He was just going out over their internet connection, and he was only doing it after hours, and they weren't there anyway. So it never really cost them any money, right? Now, I was talking to this guy at the FBI for an article that will be out in Tech Review in the October issue. And this is very disturbing. There's a software company in Massachusetts that people hate. I don't know which software company this is, and he wouldn't tell me, but I got the impression it might be like a filtering software company, like NetNanny or somebody, but it's probably not them. And this guy who hated them sat in a park bench outside their company headquarters, associated to their wireless LAN, picked up usernames and passwords, used those usernames and passwords to log into their Exchange server using the CEO's password and some other vice presidents, downloaded all their email, and posted it onto a website. And this actually cost the company $10 million. And the reason it cost them $10 million is because different customers had different prices. And the customers who were paying more money saw that there were customers who were paying dramatically less money and had negotiated better contracts. And they either terminated their contracts or they demanded the lower prices. And they actually had a loss of $10 million. Now, normally when you bring in the FBI, the FBI's ground rule is that you can't decide whether or not they prosecute. If you bring them in, they get to prosecute. And in this occasion, the FBI, they said, we want to be able to decide whether you prosecute or not. And the FBI is sort of coming up to speed on wireless LAN stuff. And so they agreed to do it. They found the guy, and the company said, we don't want to prosecute. We just wanted to know how this happened. Thank you. So this is not going to go anywhere. except in little talks.
How did they find the guy?
How did they find the guy? Well, there's this thing they call methods and techniques, sources and methods. They didn't tell me how they found the guy, but I don't know.
From the wireless connection, it was probably from the website.
You could infer some things. You could infer how the break-in occurred, but yeah, I think they found it through the website. But certainly if he hadn't posted it, they never would have found out. He could have just sent it to all the other customers. No, that's the thing about these hacker attacker guys. They're usually really good at one little thing, and then they just... What? What was so funny? I missed it.
You said it.
Oh yeah, they're usually good at one little thing, and then they can't. They just can't execute. So the people who are really good at writing these viruses, they have no payload that does anything interesting. They could like wipe your machine or reset the ROM, the flash BIOS, but they don't do that. They just propagate. So it turns out there are really good 802.11 solutions. You can place the access points outside your corporate LAN, like in the DMZ or on a separate internet connection. And this is what I do. And you can open it to everybody, and you can audit it. You can use a program like ARPWatch to detect unknown, unauthorized users. You can record all the traffic on the wireless LAN. You can make people come in with IPsec. You can use this 802.1x thing, and support for that is built into XP. And it's supposed to be good, but, IPsec works really well. And PPTP works fairly well. And my feeling is we have these very well understood security protocols that work equally well if you're coming in from the hotel or if you're coming in from somebody's wireless LAN on the other side of the city or the country. And so that's probably a better approach, and we should just always view wireless as something outside the corporate LAN. So I'm going to now talk about a research project that I have started, and I'm going to be a graduate student this fall at MIT, and this may be what I'm doing for my thesis. These are hard drives that I've purchased for $10 each. And I'm buying a lot of them. And it's really interesting. I'm looking for covert channels. There are all these stories about people who bought used computers or used hard drives, and then they found interesting data on them. So in the 1980s, there was a story running around about the Federal Witness Protection Program that sold computers without sanitizing the hard drives. I have repeated that many, many times, but now that I'm actually doing research, I'm looking for the reference, and I haven't found it. So if anybody has a reference, please let me know. We do know that in 1990s, IRS sold 40,000 pounds of computers containing tax records that did not have their hard drives cleaned. Recently, the state of Pennsylvania did the same thing. And of course, in 2001, the Al-Qaeda laptop was discovered by the Wall Street Journal, and that had lots of good data that should have been sanitized. And it turns out that we're really putting these computers in well, there's this program where all these old computers from the federal government are supposed to be sanitized and then given out to schools. And it's being done in prisons. So remember that old story about these people in prison who were doing telemarketing calls, and then they misused the data and they started harassing people? Well, there's a whole bunch of prisoners who are now processing X computers from the federal government, and they've processed so far 150,000 computers. I don't know whether these systems have been sanitized first or not. Certainly something I'll have to look into. There actually is a Department of Defense standard for sanitizing hard drives. And all you have to do is degauss it with a Type 1 degausser, whatever that is, or degauss it with a Type 2 degausser, whatever that is. Now, it's important to note that if you degauss a hard drive, it will not work again, because degaussing removes the low-level formatting information, the tracks, and it's just toast. You can overwrite all the addressable locations with a character and then its complement, and then a random character, and then verify. But this method is not approved for sanitizing media that contains top-secret information, and I'll discuss why in a bit. Or you can destroy, disintegrate, incinerate, pulverize, shred, or melt the drive. And that works. Now, it turns out there are sanitization tools that are widely available. If you're using FreeBSD like I do, all you have to do is copy dev random onto the raw device. And that overwrites all the data. And, you know, that removes it. There's a program called Scrub that was developed by this guy named Jim Garlick at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, which actually writes pseudorandom data in 6 passes. And I've been exchanging mail with him. Jim Garlick did not know about the federal standard. He just thought that this would be a good way of cleaning hard drives. Access Data is a really great company. They're the people who sell the cryptanalysis tools. So like if you lose access to your Microsoft Money file and has a password, they'll sell you a program that will crack it for you. And they have one that cracks Quicken and one that cracks QuickBooks and so forth. Well, they have this program called Secure Clean that will go after individual files and slack space and basically make sure that the files that you've deleted are actually deleted. And they have a program called Wipe Drive that actually wipes the drive. Excuse me.
Something like Secure Clean ships in Windows XP now. It's called Crypt, I think, or Cipher.exe. It nukes the free space on a disk.
That's great. I haven't seen it in my travails of Windows XP, but
It's called like a Crypt or Cipher.
it's a big operating system. I will look for that. Unfortunately, it's not automatic. You know, you really would like Windows XP, NT, has this background process which goes through your swap space and constantly zeros pages as it finds them. That's the idle task. And I think that's a bad idle task because it means that you get different behavior on a computer that's heavily loaded and not heavily loaded. Heavily loaded machines do not get clean object reuse, and lightly loaded machines do. So it should probably be putting some other data there, like random data. But certainly going after all the slack space on a regular basis would be a good background task. It would damage your life on your laptops. There's this thing called Navajo Lock with voice, which actually has like a shredder, Navajo shredder. That's misspelled. And there are many more. Of course, as you all know, format C: does not erase the hard drive. It looks like it's erasing the hard drive. It reads every sector on the hard drive, and it uses that to figure out the bad blocks. But it doesn't write every sector. Does anybody here know why it doesn't write every sector?
It doesn't have to.
Well, yeah, but why doesn't it? Because it takes longer. It actually takes longer to write a block than to read a block. And what you really care about when you're formatting a disk is whether you can read the blocks back or not, because you're trying to map where all the bad blocks are so you don't write there. Speaking of bad blocks, it turns out that on modern hard drives, there's a certain amount of space that is reserved for bad blocks. And as the drive operates, if it sees a block failing, it will actually map that block out and use another block from its bad block table. And this is automated on some drives and not on other drives. It happens more on SCSI drives than IDE drives, but it really does happen. And the problem is that if a block is mapped out, then you sanitize the hard drive. The mapped block, well, it was mapped out before it actually failed. And so the data that you thought you sanitized might still be on the disk in this other place that somebody might know how to get to. Then you have this problem with hostile drives. Now, this is largely theoretical, except you can do it. A hard drive could detect that you're trying to sanitize it and simply not comply. In fact, it could lie. It could claim that it's sanitizing, and it could store the data that you're trying to sanitize in the bad block area, and then it could say, okay, I'm now dead, and then you pull the drive and you send it back to the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer reads the bad block area and gets your stuff. And even worse, if you're in a SCSI environment or in an IDE environment, the drive could take over other drives and read data off the other drives and then claim to be DOA, and it's stolen your data now. And it could do this in a viral sense. It could actually do this and then leave that program on another hard drive in the system. And then that other hard drive could do it and leave the program, and then it could go bad. And this might be a very clever way for sneaking data out of a classified facility. And Bob Baldwin, sorry?
All those disk drives you bought?
Yeah, I'm only reading them on a Unix system. Yes?
Now, of course, policy will determine at how much of a risk you're at, because Uncle Sam, one of his subsidiaries, is using a private bit of grinder to grind hard disk surfaces. Now, you have to be pretty good to read those hard disks after that.
Well, it's true. It's the amount of sanitization that's done and how it's done. And remember, the slide that I took up, you can always melt the drives. And it's very hard to get the data off the drive after it's been melted. So Bob Baldwin came up with this hard disk virus idea, but he never implemented it. They did come up with a printer virus, though, which was very clever. It ran in PostScript printers, and it waited for keywords to appear in documents, and then it made a copy of the document on a hard drive somewhere. They never sold that. It turns out there's a solution to this. You can write a pseudo-random number pattern throughout the disk, and then you can read, so it's based on a key. And the hard drive doesn't know that it's this keyed data. It just looks like random data. And then you read back each block, and you verify that the random data that you wrote, the pseudo-random data, is actually the same as the data that you are reading. And you record so much data on the drive that the drive had to actually record your data. It couldn't just archive it. It couldn't scroll it away in the bad block area. In some applications, it may be okay to only read back 1% of the bad blocks. In some applications, you may have to read them all. And this is why that DoD standard says, write the random data and verify. If you verify that the random data that you wrote is the random data that you read back, it's kind of hard to imagine what the drive is doing with the data. A company called Los Altos Technologies commercialized this in the 1990s, a program called UniShred Pro. Los Altos Technologies is now one guy. And his program is included as bids on many federal contracts. And he gets about $300,000 to $400,000 a year on this. And all he has to do is know all of the proprietary secret ways of getting at the bad block area. So he talks to the drive vendors. Yeah.
But couldn't you measure the entropy of what's getting written, and if you're getting random blocks and you just don't archive those?
You could measure the entropy, but the neat thing about a good encryption algorithm is that if the encryption algorithm is good, the entropy is indistinguishable from random data.
But, usually the data that's more interesting would be things like text files and things like that. So.
Right, but if you actually overwrite the entire drive, then it's not going to have text data left anywhere. Yeah.
I'm a little confused. If I don't fully trust my drive, why don't I just encrypt all the real data that I'm sending to the drive, and I don't care about anything else?
Oh.
With a key that I...
Right, why don't we use a cryptographic file system, for instance, and never actually store plain text data on the drive?
Or the key.
Or the key. Well, that's a very good idea, but in practice, it's hard to do. For example, it's very hard to do for drives that are used for swap, because memory gets echoed out to the drive. And it's very hard to do with applications that you don't entirely trust, because they might have temp files. So you've got to assume that if the drive is in a computer, that it's going to have plain text data on it. Now, I have a solution for that, which is sort of a variant on that, and we'll discuss that in a bit. Yeah.
Is it true that if you only overwrite the data once, it's still recoverable?
Yes, it is. It depends on how much money you want to spend. I'll get to that in a second. If I don't, bring it up again. So the real hard disk declassification problem is actually compliance. Disk sanitization is expensive. It takes time. It's not really a money thing. It's a time thing. The tools are hard to use. You have to do something. XP has this thing, but even I didn't know about it. And we have poor adoption. It's just easier to do nothing. Now, at least that's what I think. I'm not really sure if compliance is a problem. There is this anecdotal evidence, and common sense says it's a problem. But on the other hand, there actually are very few stories. Compared to all the sensitive data that's been stored on hard drives over the last 25 years, the fact that there are probably 20 stories that have made the newspapers indicates that there might not really be a problem, right? So perhaps we're only hearing the best stories, or perhaps there are a lot of stories out there and we're not hearing them. And really the only way to find out is to buy a lot of drives and look for confidential data, and so that's what I'm doing. It's just sort of like Pete Shipley dialing every phone number in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was hard to know if dial-up modems were a vulnerability or not, a real vulnerability, until you do that study. And it's kind of hard to know if the hard drives is a problem or not until you actually do the study. Now, I sort of got into this in 1998. I bought 10 used computers. Actually, I bought them to test out Phone Sweep. And they were all 386s or 486s. And I discovered that they all had data on them. The first one had been the file server for a law firm. and it had client confidential information on it. And what I learned was that lawyers do really boring things. Really boring things, like a lot of wills. The second thing was an office computer. This one was a lot more interesting. The company had delivered mental health services on contract basis to the state government in a small community. And it had names of people, and it had diagnoses. Really good stuff. The third system was like Quicken files, emails, letters to the person's 19-year-old daughter at college, stuff like that. I called up the computer store that I bought this stuff from, and he said, oh, gosh, I'm sorry, I forgot to... Can you delete all the data for me? Hey, I was a friend, so I deleted all the data. But that got me interested in this. So the goals of the current study is to first develop a vocabulary for talking about sanitization. There isn't one that I'm familiar with. The NSA may have one, but I haven't found it on their website. I want to characterize current sanitization practices. I want to develop some forensic tools for analyzing drives. Now, there are tools out there. Some of them are proprietary. Some of them are commercial. There are very few that are, sort of like, I don't want to use the term open source because I know Microsoft thinks that open source is like a security risk to national security. But sort of research tools in the research domain that researchers can share amongst themselves. I want to develop some search facilities. I want to be able to ask 1,000 hard drives a question and get an interesting answer. Maybe I want to promote best practices, and maybe I want to come up with a way of doing this in hardware. And my best way for doing this in hardware to date is to build an encryption algorithm into the IDE drive controller on the IDE drive and either store the key in like an EEPROM that you can pull off, and then you know the key is gone. Or maybe another way would be to have a push button, and you push the button and the key gets reset in flash RAM or something. Another idea is if you use RAID 5, and you simply break up the RAID set and you send the drives to different places, then the data is not recoverable. On the other hand, if you use RAID 0 or RAID 1, the data is recoverable because with RAID 0 is mirroring. Now you just have 2 copies. RAID 1 is striping, but the stripe size is usually many blocks. Yeah?
RAID 5 uses large stripe sizes too, so it's conceivable that small files might be completely intact on a RAID.
Large stripe sizes, but it's done at the bit level, and it has to be because you need to be able to recover. If you have 3 drives and you lose one, you need to be able to recover the data from the 2 drives. So I believe, I haven't gone through my RAID book, but I believe most RAID 5 implementations, if you have just one drive, you can't get the data off. Because if the data was actually written in clear text on one drive, and that was the drive that you lost, then you're toast. So I don't think it works that way. I could be wrong.
I think it has A, data A, and then B on the other one, and then the third one you have A XOR B. So it would be in plain text.
Yeah. Well,
unless you have the specific sector which is XOR of the other 2. So you would have 2/3 of the sector in plain text.
Yeah, but if the question is if you only have one of the drives,
you would have 2/3 of the sectors in
you might have
text,
2/3.
1/3 of the first drive, 1/3 of the other drive, and 1/3 unusable.
So yeah.
Figure contributes to the problem. They rotate which drive per sector, per block is used for parity. So half of the time, well, one in n of the time, you're going to have parity on any given drive. So 1/n of the data.
So there'll be some data there. So,
Yeah.
so you're
Right.
better off with RAID 5, but maybe you still want to do the encryption. Well, that's good. So my project's ground rules is I'm only buying IDE drives because I don't want to deal with SCSI. They cost more. I'm only buying drives that are 200 meg for like 4 gig. I'm really looking only at FAT16 and FAT32 file systems, and I'm not doing extraordinary measures. Now, I'm not using an electron microscope. It turns out that the hard drive head doesn't always write down the center of the track. And so if you use an electron microscope or you use special microcode, you can read the out of track data, and it might be enough to actually pull valid data off. And there are, if you like put the oscilloscope on the head, and somebody had written all zeros or all ones, you can look at the modulations below that, and you might be able to pick up the data. I'm not doing any of that. That's too hard. Yeah?
Wouldn't you want to look at NTFS file systems because they probably have more interesting corporate data on them?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a user-level NTFS implementation. I have a FAT16 and FAT32 implementation in source code. And so, but I'll certainly characterize how many NTFS file systems I get. It turns out that most of the drives you can find on the used market were actually being used around 95 to 2000. And pretty much all the drives that I found so far, a lot of, they're FAT32. I found one drive that had been used on a Unix system. I thought that was really weird. So anyway, I have this levels of sanitization, which you probably can't read. But my level 0 is no attempt was made, which basically means you mount the drive, and there are the files. Level 1 is that the obvious files were erased, but there are some files that remain, like the Windows temporary directory or the browser cache or spool directories. Interestingly, all of the corporate drives that I have found so far, the level 0 files are gone. They actually deleted the files, but I have found level 1 files. Level 2 is that they actually erased the files, and you have to go in and look for erased files with like Norton Utilities or my proprietary tools. Level 3 is that the disk was formatted or fdisked, and you actually have to go in and unformat the disk or go in block by block. And level 4 is that the disk was sanitized with a proper file cleaning utility. All the data was overwritten, and I'm not going to go with new microcode. I don't have the time. So far, I've gotten the drives from auctions, eBays, surplus dealers, and computer stores. There's this place down in Silicon Valley called Weird Stuff. Anybody familiar with it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you go into Weird Stuff, and they sell used drives. And for $40 to $50, they will sell you drives that have been fdisked. And for $5 to $10, they will sell you drives that have not been fdisked. And so please don't go down there and buy all their drives. I have to do that later on. But you get the idea that they're selling them to hobbyists. Somebody who wants a 500 meg drive and doesn't want to buy a new drive for some reason. And they want to be able to tell them, look, we've tested the drive and it works. And the way they test it is they fdisk it and they run format C. And they find out if there are any bad blocks. It's interesting. I gave you a statistically meaningful sample. It's not just numbers of drives, but getting them from a lot of different sources. Tracking the drives is going to be a real challenge. I've decided to get 1,000 drives because 100 didn't seem like enough, and 10,000 seemed like more than I wanted to deal with. But guarding against collection bias is clearly something that I have to do. And the analysis technique, I'm using a FreeBSD system because it's easy to add and remove IDE drives from a running system with FreeBSD. So I just attach the drive, I image it. This step will go away when I have a good user-level file system. Right now I'm mounting the drive then, and I'm tarring it off and unmounting it, and I'm detaching the drive. It takes 10 to 20 minutes per drive. Now, is this legal? Good question. Well, thankfully, the Supreme Court issued a ruling on this, just for me. The case of California v. Greenwald. This actually happened when I was in journalism school. What happened was that the police had gone to this guy and had seized his garbage bags and then had gone through his garbage bags for evidence that he was a drug dealer. And they didn't get a search warrant. And the court concluded that since Greenwald had placed his refuse at the curb for the express purpose of conveying it to a third party, the trash collector, who might himself have sorted through it or permitted others, such as the police, to do so, he didn't really have an expectation of privacy. And in fact, there's officially no expectation of privacy in things that you throw out, or I guess that you sell at surplus. Private snooping has an even lower standard because this is the government, this is the police searching, and they have more restrictions on what they can do than I do without a warrant. Sorry?
On a related point, I saw a news article in the past 3 to 6 months about a guy who does the same thing with answering machine tapes.
Oh, that's great. If you can get me that, I'd really like that.
I'll try and...
That'd be wonderful. Yeah, and you could sell them. Although there are copyright issues with the answering machine tapes. And I think my next slide discusses, no, it doesn't. So one thing that I'm not doing is that I'm not taking the software off the drives and then running it. because that would be a copyright violation. And like if I find email, officially the copyright of the email is with the author of the email, not the recipient. So I think if I published the email, there would be some copyright issues. And I still have to worry about copyright. But in terms of privacy issues, there aren't any legal ones.
How much email is actually copyrighted?
Everything is copyrighted in this world. But the act of writing it. I'm sorry?
Not sent to the Library of Congress.
No, it doesn't have to be sent to the Library of Congress anymore. You only have to register in the Library of Congress if you want to get damages when you sue people if you want to get legal fees and treble damages when you sue people for copyright violation. But I can just write something on a piece of paper. The act of fixing it makes it copyrighted. So my preliminary findings is that the drives that are sold as is usually have complete file systems. The ones that are sold guaranteed non-DOA have usually been fdisked and formatted, but you can usually get the data off by running strings. And I don't have better utilities right now, but I will have some in a few months. And some drives have actually been overwritten with random data, and I was stunned. I was just stunned. I said, whoa, this drive has random data on it. They actually cleaned it. Nobody talks about sanitization practices when they sell the file. Here's one of my first trophies. This is a company called GenCell. This is a memorandum, June 20th, 1996. And it's a study that they're doing for their CD8 DLI development project. We think that they are developing an AIDS test. We're not sure. It has not come to market yet. The company has been bought and sold a few times. I'm trying to contact them, but I haven't found them yet. Here's another trophy. This was from an ISP that was giving a series of briefings in Chicago, Illinois on May 21st to talk about streaming media solutions from Digital Express. And here's the list of names that it was sent to. This is their mail merge list, and so forth. And you can say, like, Mr. David Anderson, CIO of American Family Mutual Insurance. This is an Excel spreadsheet of a company that was engaged in import-export operations. And this is like, ports of call and stuff and dollar figures and stuff and so forth. And then I found this guy. So, does anybody here recognize this guy? Oh, good. Okay. So I can tell you that I found this photograph on a hard drive that belonged to this guy. I'm not sure if it's his hard drive, but I can tell you that the guy was 45 years old and is paying child support. I have his name, his social security number, his bank account numbers. I have his email. I know that he met this girl in Savannah and that they went to Copenhagen together. And I also know he's really into pornography. But I don't know if it's this guy. So, current work, I am creating better tools for doing automated accession and automated backups, cryptographically signing the images. I'm creating this user-level MS-DOS file system that will be able to give me all the deleted files, and will work on drives that have been formatted, and can also identify all the slack space so I can manipulate that in a uniform fashion. I want to be able to find interesting data in a 1 to 10 terabyte size set. And so that's sort of an AI natural language text processing problem, but it's a good problem. I've also started this MD5 collection project. I'm basically building a database of the MD5 code for every file there is. And that way, now of course I'll never do that, right? But this way when I get a new drive, I can look at the MD5s of all the files, and if I can find the files that I've never seen before, and I'll actually have a download that people can download and give me all their MD5s and get a list of their files that I don't have. So maybe you guys will all run that on your machines. Because the MD5s aren't confidential. It's just the files that generated the MD5s that are confidential. This might be a big sinkhole. On the other hand, I might actually get some interesting data there. There is some related work. There's a MD5 database of child pornography. And this company called Encase Forensic, Guidance Software, has actually developed tools for looking over hard drives for forensic investigations, and it's also used a lot. My slides are on the web if you want, and so you can get all the URLs. And this is basically used in court cases a lot you go in, you get their hard drives for discovery, and then you can ask it questions. And this one is really neat, but I don't know if it's smoke and mirrors or not. But they have a way of fingerprinting parts of the image so that if you have child porn, but you take your neighbor's child and put their head on the child porn, they can still identify it from their database of non-MD5 codes. And I don't know if it works or not. There are these ethical issues, like the privacy of the people whose hard drives I get. And I'm not really sure the appropriate thing to do. I was talking about this with a grad student at MIT, and he said, well, you're going to anonymize all your findings, right? And I looked at him and I said, well, why? And then I thought about that. Maybe I should. Certainly, the MIT Committee on the Use of Humans as Experimental Subjects would have something to say about that, but it's not clear that they have something to say about this. But there certainly should be a responsible way of publishing the results. And then there's the issue of disposing of the drives. Should I sanitize the drives before I throw them out? And then how do you throw out 1,000 disk drives? And eliminating the problem, clearly operating system changes and hardware changes, as I spoke about before, modifying the IDE drive controllers. So this is the dissent in that California v. Greenwell case. Scrutiny of another's trash is contrary to commonly accepted notions of civilized behavior. I suspect that this case that members of our society will be shocked to learn that the court, the ultimate guarantor of liberty, deems unreasonable our expectation that aspects of our private lives that are concealed safely in a trash bag will not become public. Justice Brennan. And in fact, when this case came up, I wanted to organize a class trip from my journalism school down to the houses of the Supreme Court members and get their trash. Nobody wanted to do it. They all thought they'd be arrested. And I just didn't have the time. So that's all. Thanks so much. Yeah, back.
You may know that Boeing has an enormous surplus operation south of here.
I'm looking forward to finding out more about it.
Yeah, you can get vast amounts of machines for $10, $20.
I'm really interested in buying used hard drives around Air Force bases to find out if, like, classified data has made it to home machines, and then those machines can be sold. But you know, we have all this anecdotal story, but nobody's really done the study, and it might not be a big problem. Like I was talking to somebody at Stuart Baker, who used to be chief counsel at NSA, and the first thing he said was I was going to be killed. And the second thing he said was that the information I found would probably be too old to be interesting, and so it really wouldn't represent a security problem. So we'll find out. We'll find out. Any other questions?
What should we do if you disappear?
That's not going to happen. My little girl's here in the front row, and she's all worried now. Don't be worried. Yeah.
You mentioned the memory on fax machines. There's a similar issue with copiers now that copiers aren't copiers anymore.
Yeah.
But they're scanner printers. Do you have any information on vulnerabilities of information?
You're right. Copier machines are now scanner printers, and many of them will scan much faster than they can print. And I do know that Xerox has brought out a new scanner printer, aka copier machine, which sanitizes itself after the data has been printed. But the fact that they actually flew somebody to Boston to discuss this with me indicates to me that other vendors don't have that. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned smart cards and security vulnerabilities.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Smart cards and security vulnerabilities.
I know IBM found the issue with the SIM chip on emittance of voltage changes outside the chip. Now, the one that was presented for the talk last month, the one that was discussed in New York Times, that was not a smart card, but a microcontroller, I was told. Now, do you know what is capable as far as smart cards and what is not?
Well, on the issue of power lines, when I flirted with taking a job at the NSA, one of the things they took great delight in showing me was their blacker boxes. And a blacker box is a box that has a black wire going in and a red wire coming out, and it's a power line. And the red wire goes to the computer, and that has classified power fluctuations on it. And the blacker box turns it into a black wire, and it removes all the classified power fluctuations. So the implication is that by looking at power lines, you can learn a lot about what a computer is doing. Now, remember, all that work was done in the 70s and in the 80s when computers were a lot slower and they weren't like running Windows and 10,000 events weren't being run to PowerPoint as you move the cursor across the screen. So it may be less of an issue now. The problem with microcontrollers and smart card controllers is that they're very slow machines. And so with very fast machines to analyze them, you can learn a lot. And of course, the other problem with a smart card is that you have it in your hand, and it will keep doing whatever you ask it to do as many times as you want. And a lot of the attacks control the clock or control the power, and they look at, Adi Shamir came up with differential fault analysis, so by lowering the power you can see the way the card breaks. These are things you can defend against if you're making the silicon. Some people may be doing that, like you can put a voltage regulator in. It notices if the clock is too slow or if the voltage has gone down, and it shuts off or it destroys its key material or something. But that costs money, and you have to do it. And, you know, who's auditing the smart cards? Not many people. Yeah.
It's just kind of a question for the audience. I wonder if anybody from ITG is here. I think there's some interesting follow-up issues that have been brought up. I loaded NetStumbler, and it doesn't recognize my Cisco card, but I think that the issue of the 802.11 is something that ought to be followed up on. Is anybody from the Windows group here that could take this issue of a wipe back? I looked in the help for Windows XP, and there was no help at all there in terms of how to complete.
I believe Cipher.exe does have wipe.
Are you talking about Cipher block chaining?
No. Cipher.exe is a command line interface to EFS.
Okay, well that would exclude those of us who don't use the command line interface, I guess.
Yeah. What I would like on Windows XP, as long as I'm giving you my wish list, is I would like to be able to tell Windows XP that I'm giving the computer to somebody else. And I would like to have it remove my personal information, and then I would like to have it give me the choice of giving them my copyrighted programs, like Word, or removing them from the system. Because, a lot of software piracy is happening with people selling computers. They say, oh, well, I'm not selling you the apps. I'm going to keep the apps, but, you got a copy of them. Do what you want. And I think that we've used computers long enough now, and we know sort of the life cycle of computers. Like, I'm done with it, and I give it to people who don't make as much money as I do, and then they give it to people who are even less computer aware. And there should be a way for telling the machine, I'm now transferring ownership. Do something reasonable. And something reasonable is probably not finding the CD-ROM that the machine came from and doing a clean install, because that installs all the old security vulnerabilities. And a lot of computers now don't even come with CD-ROMs. Yeah.
That security is actually being implemented not by us, but by some smart card chip vendors that put the smart card chip onto the box, which you can configure the keys to do, whatever, and that would actually take care of some of your encryption problem with the hard disk.
Yeah, I believe that the hard disk encryption problem is basically going to be solved with hardware on the IDE hard drive. I believe that there has to be a way of pressing a button on the hard drive or pulling a chip, and you know that the drive has been sanitized. And it should be easy to do, and I'll probably implement it over the next 2 years as a demonstration. I believe once you involve a smart card or the operating system, that there are too many places for it to go wrong. I really just want to be able to touch something on the drive and know that that drive has been wiped. The only way to do that is by encrypting everything on the drive with some sort of symmetric cipher that uses the block number as part of the key, and then wiping the key.
Let's take one more question.
Yeah, one more question, and then Sonia's getting bored. So, one last question. Anybody who hasn't asked the question? Anybody who has asked the question? Oh, there may not be a last question.
Is this presentation available to us or not?
Yeah, you'll be able to watch it. You can watch this on ResNet.
Okay.
It's on ResNet, and These PowerPoint files are also on my server, although they'll probably be moving. But
We can find them anyway.
yeah, you can find them anyway. Okay, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Simson will be here for a little while signing.